Welcome back to Roots of Fear, where the darkest stories hidden within the shadows are brought to light. This evening, our journey takes us into the mist-shrouded hills of Antebellum, Tennessee, where whispers of an impossible phenomenon still linger among the ancient oaks and abandoned homesteads. In the year 1845, when Tennessee was still a young state and the Cumberland Plateau stood as a formidable barrier separating civilization from the untamed wilderness, there existed a remote valley that the Holloway family called home. Their whitewashed farmhouse stood stark against the verdant hillside, its wooden boards weathered by seasons of punishing rain and merciless sun, yet maintaining an unsettling, pristine quality that travelers often remarked upon in hushed voices. The family patriarch, Ezekiel Holloway, had established himself as a successful tobacco farmer, his fields stretching across the fertile lands like a patchwork quilt of earthy browns and vibrant greens. His wife, Abigail, was known throughout the region for her uncommonly youthful appearance, despite having given birth to 6 children. Locals would comment that her skin remained as smooth as porcelain, her auburn hair untouched by silver, her movements as lively and sprightly as a maiden's. What few outsiders understood was that the Holloway household concealed a terrible secret, one that defied both natural law and Christian doctrine. With each child born to Abigail, a peculiar transformation would overcome the family. Instead of the expected marks of age, the creased brow, the stooped posture, the weathered hands, the parents would appear to grow younger with each birth, as though the years were flowing backward through their bodies like sand in a reversed hourglass. This phenomenon first became apparent after the birth of their 3rd child, when observant neighbors noted that the lines which had begun to form around Ezekiel's eyes had mysteriously vanished. By the arrival of their 5th child, both Ezekiel and Abigail seemed to be in the flush of youth, their countenances resembling those of newlyweds rather than parents of a growing brood. The valley's physician, Dr. Hammond Winthrop, documented his observations with a trembling hand in a journal bound in cracked leather, its yellowed pages filled with increasingly distressed handwriting. "I have delivered unto Mrs. Holloway her 6th child this eve," he wrote on a rain-lashed night in October of 1845. "Though I attended her birthing of the firstborn when she was 27 years of age, she now appears no older than 16 summers. Mr. Holloway, once bearded and broad-shouldered, as befits a man of 38 years, now resembles a youth hardly past his 20th year. I cannot reconcile these observations with medical science, nor with God's natural order." More disturbing still were the whispers concerning the Holloway children, who seemed to age at an accelerated rate when in proximity to their rejuvenated parents. The eldest daughter, Elizabeth, exhibited the grey hair and stooped posture of a woman thrice her age, though she had seen but 15 winters. The youngest, an infant son, developed teeth and speech with unnatural haste, while his eyes held the weighted gaze of ancient knowing. The local minister began to refuse calls to the Holloway estate, crossing himself whenever the family name was mentioned. Rumors spread like wildfire through the Tennessee countryside, speaking of unholy pacts, of forbidden knowledge gleaned from tattered tomes, of sacrifices made beneath the cold light of the moon. Our correspondence with Dr. Winthrop came to an abrupt end in the winter of 1846, when his housekeeper discovered the physician slumped over his desk, a quill still gripped in his lifeless fingers. The final entry in his journal described a house call to the Holloway residence, where Abigail had announced her 7th pregnancy with a smile that stretched too wide across a face impossibly smooth and unmarked by the 34 years she had walked upon this earth. The physician's death was attributed to heart failure, though the local coroner noted the expression of abject terror frozen upon his features. More curious still were the strands of auburn hair clutched in his hand, identical in hue to Abigail Holloway's famous tresses, despite the lady not having left her property in the fortnight preceding the doctor's demise. The winter that followed brought unprecedented suffering to the Tennessee highlands. Livestock perished in their barns, crops withered in storehouses, and children succumbed to fevers that burned through their small bodies like wildfire. Yet the Holloway farm remained untouched by misfortune. Their fields yielded abundant tobacco despite the frost, their cattle grew fat on seemingly barren pastures, and the bloom of health continued to suffuse the cheeks of the increasingly youthful parents. In the neighboring town of Miller's View, the apothecary's ledgers from this period record unusual purchases by Ezekiel Holloway, mandrake root, belladonna, powdered bone of unknown origin, and quantities of quicksilver that would prove lethal in any conventional medical treatment. The apothecary himself, one Thaddeus Merriweather, penned a letter to his cousin in Nashville describing the transformation in his customer. Mr. Holloway, who first came to my establishment as a man of mature years, now appears as though fresh from schooling. His voice carries the timbre of youth, his gait possesses the sprightliness of a bridegroom. Yet his eyes contain multitudes of years, as though an ancient being peers through the countenance of adolescence. It was the birth of the seventh Holloway child that brought matters to their inevitable crescendo. Midwives refused to attend Abigail, crossing themselves and muttering prayers when approached. Eventually, a traveling midwife, unfamiliar with local law, was secured for the delivery. The woman, Patience Blackwell of South Carolina, kept meticulous notes of her birthing cases in a small cloth-bound book discovered among her possessions after her disappearance. Her final entry reads, "Called to the Holloway farm for the birthing of their seventh. Found the mother in good spirits, appearing no older than a girl of 14 summers. Her husband similarly youthful. The house possessed an unnatural warmth despite no fire in the grate. The 5 elder children watched from the shadows, their faces lined with decades they have not lived, eyes clouded as those of the very ancient. The 6th child, though only 2 years old, spoke in complete sentences and calculated sums with alarming proficiency. The birth proceeded with uncommon swiftness, the child emerging as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight. Upon the infant's first breath, I observed the most uncanny transformation, a ripple of youth washing over both parents until they appeared as children themselves, while the newborn's eyes reflected the knowledge of centuries. 3 days after the birth, the traveling midwife Patience Blackwell vanished without a trace or word of farewell. The only evidence of her passage through the valley was her abandoned midwifery bag, discovered beside the crossroads where Holloway land met the county thoroughfare. Inside, nestled among her birthing implements, lay a peculiar glass vial containing what appeared to be a single drop of frozen quicksilver, immovable despite the warmth of the spring air. Sheriff Ambrose Whitley, a broad-shouldered man with a face permanently creased by suspicion, rode out to the Holloway property that same afternoon. A veteran of the Seminole Wars with a pronounced limp and a penchant for chewing tobacco, Whitley had served as county sheriff for 17 years and prided himself on maintaining order through a combination of intimidation and pragmatic justice. Yet the scene that greeted him at the Holloway farmhouse disturbed him more than any murderer he had ever apprehended. The children were arranged around the parlor like elderly courtiers, he later confided to Reverend Thomas Hargrove over a tumbler of whiskey. The eldest, Elizabeth, could not have seen 20 years, yet her spine curved like a question mark and liver spots mottled her hands. But the parents, dear God in heaven, they appeared as mere children playing at keeping house. Indeed, Ezekiel and Abigail Holloway had undergone a transformation so complete as to defy rational explanation. The once formidable farmer now stood no taller than a boy of 11, his voice carrying the high reedy quality of pre-adolescence. Abigail, cradling their newborn with practiced ease, possessed the slight frame and unformed features of a girl barely past her first decade. Only their eyes betrayed their true nature, ancient, calculating, and filled with knowledge no child could possibly possess. "We require no assistance regarding Miss Blackwell's departure," Ezekiel had informed the sheriff, his childish voice forming the precise diction of a seasoned orator. "She received her payment and left of her own accord." Perhaps the rigors of rural life proved unsuitable for a woman of urban sensibilities. Throughout this exchange, the Holloway children remained eerily silent, their aged eyes following the sheriff's movements with predatory intensity. The infant, though barely a week old, tracked Whitley with a gaze so penetrating that the hardened lawman later admitted to feeling as though my very soul had been weighed and catalogued. Most unnerving was the collection of portraits hanging in the hallway parlor, family likenesses dating back 3 generations. Sheriff Whitley observed with mounting horror that each successive generation appeared more youthful than its predecessor, the progression culminating in the current master and mistress of the house, now physically children themselves. As spring advanced into summer, travelers reported seeing the juvenile forms of Ezekiel and Abigail working the tobacco fields alongside their elderly children, the entire family moving in perfect synchronicity like actors in some terrible, inverted pageant of nature. The tobacco itself grew with unnatural vigor, its leaves broader and more verdant than any in Tennessee memory. Yet those who purchased Holloway tobacco reported dreams of ancient, withered faces and the sensation of years being drained away like water from a punctured vessel. By mid-July, when the corn stood tall and green in neighboring fields, not a single bird could be heard singing on Holloway land, and no insect buzzed among their flourishing crops. The silence hung over the valley like a shroud, broken only by the occasional sound of childish laughter echoing from the whitewashed farmhouse, laughter that carried the timbre of centuries. In the dog days of August, when heat shimmered above the parched earth of neighboring farms, a strange frost descended upon the Holloway tobacco fields. Crystalline patterns etched themselves across broad green leaves overnight, not killing the plants, but rather enhancing their unnatural vigor. The frost formations resembled fingerprints, tiny whorls and arches glistening in the morning light before melting away like memories. Miller's View began to empty as families loaded wagons under cover of darkness, abandoning generations of settlement without explanation in their haste. Those who remained spoke in whispers of the Holloway children, now aged beyond recognition. Elizabeth, the eldest, moved with the shuffling gait of a centenarian, though she had seen but 20 summers, her hair like spun silver and her fingers gnarled as ancient roots. Contrasting this decay were the parents, who had regressed to such youth that Ezekiel could now be observed riding a hobby horse across the veranda, his childish giggles carrying unnaturally far across the valley, while Abigail, diminutive as a toddler, arranged wildflowers with hands that had previously birthed 7 children. Perhaps most disturbing were reports from the sole remaining farmhand, Jeremiah Tucker, who in a state of evident intoxication confessed to Reverend Hargrove that the 7th Holloway child had begun speaking in complete sentences at merely 8 weeks of age, conversing with its juvenile parents in a language that resembled no tongue known to God-fearing men. "The babe speaks as though it commands ancient wisdom," Tucker slurred, clutching the Reverend's sleeve with fingers stained brown from Holloway tobacco. "And when it speaks, the very air grows dense, like breathing through molasses. Time moves differently there, Reverend. I aged 3 days during one afternoon's labor, while young Master Holloway's voice cracked and rose again, his height shrinking a full inch before my eyes." Tucker vanished the following day, though his hat was discovered hanging from a fence post at the boundary of Holloway land, inexplicably filled with perfect tobacco leaves arranged in the unmistakable pattern of a human face. By September, when the tobacco harvest should have commenced, an unnatural crimson fog settled over the Holloway property, obscuring all but the faint outline of the farmhouse. From within this miasma came sounds that defied natural explanation, the laughter of children overlaid with the cracking of bones, songs sung in high, sweet voices that conveyed lyrics no child should know. The county tax assessor, Marcus Peyton, became the last official visitor to the homestead when he reluctantly performed his annual duties in early October. His written account, discovered later among county records, described a property transformed, the whitewashed farmhouse now impossibly larger inside than its exterior dimensions would permit, rooms opening onto other rooms in defiance of Euclidean geometry. Most alarmingly, he described the Holloway parents as infants with ancient eyes crawling across immaculate floors, while the 7 children had aged so dramatically that the eldest resembled nothing so much as animated mummies, their skin like parchment stretched over bone, yet moving with terrible purpose. Peyton's final notation indicated that the 7th child, though chronologically an infant, appeared physically as a man in his prime, speaking with perfect diction as he explained to the assessor that the Holloway family had finally discovered the perfect cyclical exchange of years. A peculiar entry in the Miller's View church records, dated November 1, 1846, notes the sudden arrival of Reverend Edgar Stilwell from the Diocese of Philadelphia. The young clergyman, having heard troubling accounts from his predecessor, Reverend Hargrove, who had departed with unseemly haste for a missionary position in distant Oregon Territory, came armed with both ecclesiastical authority and academic curiosity. Stilwell's private journal, recently discovered sealed within the cornerstone of the rebuilt Miller's View Chapel, reveals a man torn between scientific inquiry and spiritual dread. "I have today interviewed the 3 remaining residents who claim first-hand knowledge of the Holloway phenomenon," he wrote. Mrs. Agatha Winters, though advanced in years and somewhat addled in recollection, insists she witnessed young Elizabeth Holloway aged 10 years in the span of an afternoon tea. More telling is the testimony of Mr. Silas Caldwell, the blacksmith, a man of unimpeachable character and sober habits, who claims to have observed the infant Ezekiel, once patriarch of the estate, nurse at the breast of what appeared to be his 5-year-old wife, while their eldest children tottered about like ancients on the verge of dust. Most disturbing was my conversation with Dr. Winthrop's former assistant, a Mr. Frederick Chambers, who showed me a collection of specimens obtained from Holloway land. Among these were tobacco leaves bearing vein patterns identical to human arterial systems, and most unnervingly, a child's milk tooth that, under my own magnification glass, revealed the unmistakable growth rings one might observe in ancient timber. As winter descended upon the valley with unusual severity, Stillwell made his fateful journey to the Holloway estate. His descriptions of the approach suggest a landscape fundamentally altered, trees bent inward toward the property as if listening, the road seeming to both lengthen and contract within the same passage, and most notably, the complete absence of any track or print in the fresh snow surrounding the homestead. The farmhouse now resembles a pale tumor erupting from the earth, he wrote in his final entry, dated December 10. Its dimensions shift when viewed from different angles, and windows appear where none existed moments before. I have observed figures moving within, small crawling forms I take to be the parents, and towering skeletal silhouettes that must be the elder children. Most disquieting is the central figure, presumably the seventh child, now appearing as an adult in his prime, around whom the others orbit like celestial bodies. I have brought with me the sacramental implements and texts recommended by Archbishop Bennying for cases of unnatural phenomenon. Yet I fear what we face is neither demonic possession nor mere witchcraft, but something far more fundamental, a corruption of time itself. The Holloways appear to have discovered, or created, a closed system of years where age flows between bodies rather than progressing linearly through them. I suspect this is why no new pregnancies have been reported. The cycle requires 7 participants, no more and no less, to maintain its terrible equilibrium. Tomorrow I shall approach the house directly. I have prepared my soul for whatever revelation awaits. May God have mercy should I not return to complete this account. The journal ends abruptly. 3 days later, residents of Miller's View awoke to find the entirety of Holloway land blanketed in unseasonable tobacco blooms, their petals white as bone against the winter snow. The winter of 1847 brought with it a stillness to the Tennessee highlands that transcended ordinary seasonal quiet. No travelers ventured near the Holloway property, which now stood encircled by a perfect ring of tobacco plants flowering impossibly through snow and ice, their blossoms luminous under the cold winter moon. The road that once led to the farmhouse had all but disappeared, overgrown with pale vegetation that botanical records would later struggle to classify. In late January, a hunting party from neighboring Cooper Creek, having lost their way in an unexpected whiteoat, stumbled upon what they first took to be an abandoned churchyard. There, in a clearing surrounded by impossibly ancient oaks whose branches intertwined to form cathedral-like arches, they discovered 7 stone chairs arranged in a perfect circle. Each throne-like seat appeared to have been carved from a single massive block of limestone not native to Tennessee soil, yet no chisel marks marred their surfaces, as though they had grown from the earth itself. Tobias Fletcher, the hunting party's leader, later testified before a hastily assembled town council. Each chair different in size, he recounted, the largest grand enough for a giant, the smallest fit only for a babe. And each bore carvings that shifted when you tried to study them directly, like watching ripples in a pond rather than fixed images in stone. Most disturbing was Fletcher's account of discovering, at the center of this circle, a small depression in the earth filled with a silvery liquid that moved with apparent intelligence, retreating from the shadow of his hand when he reached toward it. The substance, he claimed, reflected not the faces of the hunters who gazed upon it, but rather their forms as they might appear at different stages of life, showing wrinkled countenances to the young men and smooth, childish features to the eldest among them. By February, livestock throughout the county began exhibiting disturbing behaviors. Cows would stand facing the direction of Holloway land for hours, their milk running dry in the span of days. Chickens laid eggs with double yolks containing perfectly formed but miniature eggs within them, a recursive pattern that farmers claimed continued inward beyond what natural sight could discern. Most alarming were reports from tenant farmer Josiah Mills, whose prized sow delivered a litter wherein each piglet bore markings resembling human fingerprints across their flesh. The regional newspaper, the Tennessee Highland Sentinel, made brief mention of an unexplained astronomical event observed exclusively over the former Holloway property, a luminous aerial phenomenon described as 7 stars arranged in the pattern of the Dipper, yet moving contrary to all established laws of celestial mechanics, appearing to age and diminish before strengthening again in endless cycle. The newspaper office burned to the ground 3 days after publication, its lead typesetter discovered amid the ashes, his body inexplicably aged to that of a man of 90 years, though he had celebrated his 25th birthday the previous month. In early March, Professor Thaddeus Warrington of Cumberland College led an expedition of scholarly inquiry to document the Holloway anomalies. His field journals, recovered after the expedition's disastrous conclusion, described the bizarre temporal distortions affecting his party as they approached the property, watches running backward, young assistants finding grey hairs sprouting overnight, while Warrington himself, a man of 63 years, observed his arthritis vanishing as juvenile vigor returned to his hands. The expedition's lone survivor, Professor Warrington's assistant Samuel Grayson, emerged from the forest 6 weeks later, his once robust frame withered to that of a consumptive, his 28 years seemingly doubled upon his countenance. Before succumbing to an undiagnosable wasting illness at Nashville Central Hospital, Grayson dictated an account to his attending physician that remained sealed in the Tennessee Medical Society archives until 1894. "We found not the Holloway house, but a perfect clearing where it should have stood," his testimony reads. 7 concentric rings of soil, each bearing different vegetation, mushrooms of impossible size in the innermost circle, then tobacco plants with leaves veined like human hands, followed by corn whose kernels formed patterns resembling faces in various stages of age. The professor insisted on collecting specimens from each ring, measuring the soil temperature, which decreased as we moved outward, contrary to natural expectation. Grayson described how the expedition established camp at the edge of the outermost ring, erecting their tents precisely at sunset. During the night, he awoke to find his companions missing, their bedrolls empty save for Professor Warrington's journal. Following voices that seemed to emanate from the clearing center, Grayson witnessed a tableau that defied rational explanation. 7 figures sat upon 7 stone thrones arranged in perfect circle. The smallest throne held what appeared to be an ancient infant, its skin like parchment, yet its proportions that of a newborn. The largest throne supported a child of perhaps 10 years, yet possessing the eyes of deepest antiquity. Between these extremes sat figures representing every stage of human development, but inverted, the younger bodies possessing older features and demeanor, while the physically mature forms displayed childish countenance and behavior. Most disturbing was Grayson's account of witnessing his fellow expedition members approach this circle voluntarily, as though compelled by music I could not hear, whereupon each was embraced by one of the throned figures. Upon contact, a visible transference occurred, like watching water flow between vessels. My companions aged decades in moments, their vitality visibly flowing into the Holloway vessels, who grew more vibrant with each embrace. The Tennessee State Militia, dispatched in May of 1847 under Colonel Jeremiah Bradford, found no trace of the stone thrones, nor any sign of human habitation on the former Holloway land. They reported instead a perfectly circular lake where no water body had previously existed, its surface exhibiting the peculiar quality of reflecting the sky not as it appeared in that moment, but rather showing atmospheric conditions that would not occur until precisely 1 week later, a phenomenon verified by meteorological records of the period. The curious case drew attention from the budding Smithsonian Institution, which commissioned geologist Erasmus Montclair to analyze soil samples from the region. His findings, published in the obscure Journal of Anomalous Terrestrial Phenomena, indicated that sediment from the Holloway property exhibited impossible layering, strata that should have taken millennia to form somehow compressed into mere decades, with pollen from plant species both extinct and not yet evolved appearing in the same samples. The final testament of Colonel Bradford surfaced decades later, discovered in the personal effects of his great-granddaughter in 1892. The document reveals details expunged from official militia records, describing how 7 of his men vanished while attempting to take depth measurements of the circular lake. Their equipment remained floating upon the surface, yet the men themselves disappeared without disturbance to the water's glassy perfection. "We observed through spyglasses," Bradford wrote in an increasingly agitated script, what appeared to be human figures suspended beneath the surface, not drowning, but rather seated in postures of contemplation at varying depths. Most disturbing was their appearance, forms that seemed to age and youth in undulating cycles, like watching a lifetime compressed into minutes, then reversed and played again with grotesque fluidity. Spring gave way to summer, and a peculiar phenomenon manifested in the vicinity of the former Holloway property. Children born within 7 miles of the site exhibited birthmarks identical in pattern, 7 interconnected circles arranged like the Pleiades constellation. More unsettling were reports from midwives that these infants emerged with expressions of profound knowing, their eyes focusing with adult comprehension from their first breath. By autumn, the forests surrounding the circular lake had transformed beyond recognition. The trees, once typical hardwoods of the Tennessee highlands, now displayed impossible characteristics: oak leaves with the texture of human skin, hickory bark that appeared to breathe imperceptibly, black walnut trees producing nuts containing not seeds, but tiny, perfect hourglasses filled with sand that flowed upward against gravity. Ornithologist Wesley Hammond documented unprecedented avian behavior in the region, noting that birds of widely varying species gathered at dusk along the lake's perimeter, arranging themselves by apparent age rather than type. Fledglings of eagle, wren, and thrush clustered together while their elders formed separate concentric rings, he wrote in his field journal before his mysterious disappearance, all facing the water in silent vigil until precisely midnight. The effect suggests a natural world attempting to mimic the unnatural temporal cycle established by the Holloway entity. I can draw no conclusion but that time itself has been wounded in this place, and nature strains to accommodate the lesion. In December of 1847, precisely 1 year after Reverend Stilwell's final journal entry, 7 children from surrounding communities vanished from their beds during the winter solstice night. Searchers followed small footprints in fresh snow that led unerringly toward Holloway land before abruptly transitioning to adult-sized tracks midway, as though the children had aged with each step taken. The lake itself began to exhibit alarming properties as winter deepened. Huntsman Elijah Porter reported that an arrow shot across its surface froze mid-flight, hanging suspended for 7 breaths before continuing its trajectory, yet the arrowhead had aged to rust while the shaft remained newly cut. Meanwhile, 7 previously unknown stars appeared in the night sky directly above the property, visible only from within county boundaries, forming a constellation that local astronomers noted rotated contrary to all celestial precedent, completing one full revolution every 7 nights. The year 1848 arrived with unnatural stillness across the Tennessee highlands. Snow fell in perfect hexagonal patterns near the Holloway property, each flake bearing microscopic images that local school teacher Miriam Cotswell documented in her private journals as faces in various stages of life and decay, arranged in circular progression. When the flakes melted upon her collection slides, they left behind residue that rearranged itself nightly into different configurations. By February, the circular lake had developed a rhythmic pattern of freezing and thawing that corresponded to no known meteorological cycle. Every 7th day, regardless of temperature, the surface would crystallize completely at precisely 7 minutes past midnight, the ice clear as polished glass. Locals who dared approach reported seeing their reflections at various ages, children glimpsing their elderly selves, gray-haired witnesses confronted with their youthful countenances. Most disturbing were accounts of seeing 7 identical reflections simultaneously, each depicting a different stage of life. The 7 missing children were never recovered, though their parents reported identical dreams each new moon, visions of their offspring seated upon stone thrones arranged in circular formation, their appearances fluctuating between infancy and decrepitude as they spoke in unison, "We maintain the balance that the Holloways began." In March, naturalist Harrison Pemberley discovered peculiar flora growing in perfect rings around the lake's perimeter, 7 bands of vegetation that upon careful examination represented plant species from different geological epochs. The innermost ring contained primitive ferns thought extinct for millennia, while the outermost displayed characteristics of theoretical evolutionary advancement that Pemberley described as botanical prophecy, what we might expect to see after centuries of natural selection yet to occur. An unnamed journalist for the Nashville Courier wrote of witnessing a flock of passenger pigeons flying in figure-8 patterns above the former Holloway property, the birds visibly aging and rejuvenating as they crossed the invisible boundary above the lake. His article never reached publication. Instead, 7 copies were discovered in his abandoned lodgings, each version written in progressively more childish handwriting, though containing identical text. The regional census taker, Obadiah Winters, noted an alarming statistical anomaly. Within a 7-mile radius of the Holloway property, no recorded deaths had occurred since winter solstice, while births had ceased entirely. The populace appears suspended between mortality's natural poles, he wrote in his official report, portions of which were subsequently redacted by federal authorities. I observed individuals with consumption, grievous injuries, and advanced age continuing in their conditions without either improvement or decline. They exist in persistent suffering without the mercy of deterioration. Most telling was the expedition mounted by geologist Professor Emmett Blackthorne in April, who employed newly developed photographic techniques to document the site. The resulting daguerreotypes, when developed, showed not the landscape photographed, but rather the same location as it had appeared in 7 different time periods simultaneously: Primeval Forest, Native American settlement, colonial farmland, the Holloway estate in its prime, the current lake formation, and most disturbingly, 2 future iterations of the land that Blackthorne refused to describe in his notes, stating only that what awaits this cursed soil violates both natural law and divine ordinance, suggesting a cyclical recurrence that transcends linear temporality. The summer of 1848 brought an unprecedented drought to all counties surrounding the Holloway property, while the circular lake maintained its perfect circumference, neither expanding nor contracting despite the harsh conditions. Most peculiar was the discovery made by local herbalist Martha Thornfield, who observed that soil collected at precise 7-foot intervals from the lake's edge produced dramatically different effects when brewed into tinctures. The innermost sample, she recorded in her meticulously maintained ledger when administered to my ailing hound, caused the creature to regress to puppyhood for precisely 7 hours before advancing rapidly to a state of arthritic senescence, then returning to its original condition by daybreak. The outermost sample, conversely, preserved a cut flower in perfect bloom for 7 weeks without water, after which it crumbled to dust in the span of 7 heartbeats. Martha's experiments attracted the attention of Dr. Augustus Sterling of the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences, who arrived in Tennessee under the pretense of studying regional botanical anomalies. His true purpose, revealed in encrypted correspondence with the recently established Department of Unusual Phenomena within the federal government, was to determine whether the Holloway anomaly might be replicated for strategic purposes. "I have established measurement stations at 7 key points surrounding the lake," Sterling wrote in a cipher that would not be decoded until 1912. "Each station contains identical timepieces, barometric instruments, and daguerreotype equipment programmed to capture images at synchronized intervals. The results defy rational explanation. At Station 1, closest to the lake, 7 minutes elapse for every single minute recorded at Station 7. More alarming is the effect on living tissue. Laboratory mice maintained at Station 1 exhibit 7 generations of offspring during the same period in which mice at Station 7 produce none, their biological processes seemingly suspended." Most revealing was the journal of Gideon Maxwell, an astronomer who constructed a modest observatory on the highlands overlooking the former Holloway land. Using a telescope of unprecedented magnification, Maxwell documented celestial aberrations visible only when viewed through the air above the circular lake. "When training my instrument through this corridor of compromised reality," he wrote in increasingly unsteady handwriting, "I observe stars not in their actual positions, but where they would have appeared in ancient skies or will appear in futures beyond my mortal span. Most disturbing is the periodic appearance of 7 perfectly aligned luminous bodies that correspond to no known heavenly catalogue. These lights arrange themselves in formations identical to the stone thrones described in earlier accounts, performing complex rotational sequences that suggest consciousness and purpose." Maxwell's final entry, dated June 21, 1848, described witnessing a phenomenon at precisely midnight during the summer solstice. 7 columns of illumination arose from the lake's surface, each a different hue, yet containing the same spectral signature when observed through my prism array. Within these pillars, I clearly observed human figures in various stages of development: infant, child, adolescent, adult, elder, and 2 states for which we have no terminology, representing existence beyond birth and death, respectively. The figures appear to exchange positions in rhythmic sequence, transferring some essence between them that caused their apparent ages to flow like water between vessels. I'm now convinced that the Holloway family discovered not immortality, but something far more profound: the ability to redistribute temporality itself, creating a closed system where the currency of years may be exchanged among willing vessels. Maxwell's observatory was discovered abandoned 3 days later, the telescope lens shattered into precisely 7 fragments, each somehow showing a different phase of the moon simultaneously when held to light. As autumn descended over the Tennessee highlands that fateful year, a peculiar pilgrimage began. Solitary travelers arrived in the region, each bearing unusual timepieces, sundials with 7 gnomons, hourglasses filled with soil rather than sand, mechanical watches with counterclockwise movements. These visitors, never arriving in groups and never acknowledging one another's presence, would make their way to the shores of the circular lake before departing precisely 7 hours later, their appearances subtly altered, grey-haired arrivals departing with darkened locks, youthful visitors leaving with a newfound stoop to their shoulders. County records from this period reference a secretive organization calling themselves the Temporal Conservatory, whose manifesto was discovered in the false bottom of a doctor's bag abandoned at the Miller's View stagecoach station. The document, written on parchment that carbon testing would later reveal to be simultaneously both centuries old and made from plants not yet in existence, outlined their beliefs with disturbing clarity. The Holloway convergence represents neither abomination nor miracle, but merely the first visible manifestation of time's true nature. What appears linear is merely our limited perception of a circular reality. The 7 vessels maintain the necessary equilibrium, preventing temporal energy from dispersing into chaos. We have identified 17 similar nodes across the globe, in Carpathian mountain caves, beneath Arabian deserts, within Himalayan peaks, each requiring maintenance through perfect cycling of 7 life forces. The Tennessee manifestation remains the most stable, having achieved self-perpetuation through the perfect Holloway 7. The region's wildlife continued its unnerving adaptation to the temporal anomaly. Huntsman Ephraim Caldwell documented deer with antlers that shed and regrew during a single observation, birds whose plumage cycled through seasonal variations in minutes rather than months, and most disturbingly, butterfly specimens whose metamorphosis reversed itself, imagos folding back into chrysalides, then emerging as caterpillars before beginning the cycle anew. In November, the lake's surface began exhibiting scriptural patterns, ripples forming characters from ancient alphabets that linguist Professor Eleanor Wellington identified as containing elements of pre-dynastic Egyptian, Proto-Sumerian, and other symbolic systems predating recorded history. Her translation, though incomplete, suggested a mathematical formula for the transference of temporal energy between living vessels. The text describes 7 stages of temporal flow, she wrote in correspondence to the newly established Smithsonian Institution, each requiring precise calibration to maintain what it terms the eternal cycle. Most troubling is the repeated reference to a 7th return, suggesting we are witnessing not the first occurrence of this phenomenon, but another iteration of a pattern that refreshes itself every 7 generations. Winter approached with uncharacteristic rapidity, leaves transitioning from green to brown to dust within 7 days. The first snowfall brought with it a profound acoustic phenomenon. Those standing within 700 yards of the lake reported hearing voices speaking in unison, the words themselves incomprehensible yet conveying unmistakable meaning to each listener. Methodist preacher Caleb Johnson described hearing instructions for perpetuating the cycle, while schoolteacher Miriam Cotswold understood the same sounds as a warning against interference with established temporal nodes. By December's first frost, 7 structures had appeared equidistant around the lake, small, doorless cabins constructed from impossibly ancient timber, yet seemingly built overnight. Each interior, glimpsed through windows that reflected observers at 7 different ages simultaneously, contained identical arrangements, 7 chairs of various sizes facing inward around a central table bearing 7 empty bowls. The winter solstice of 1848 arrived with an unnatural clarity to the air, as though the atmosphere itself had been crystallized around the Holloway property. Residents from neighboring counties reported timepieces stopping at precisely 7 minutes past midnight, resuming their mechanisms only when carried beyond the 7-mile boundary that now demarcated what locals had begun calling the Hollow Hours. Most remarkable was the testimony of Silas Thornbush, a traveling daguerreotypist who attempted to capture an image of the circular lake during the longest night of the year. Upon developing his plates, he discovered not a single image, but 7 superimposed exposures showing the same location across what appeared to be vast stretches of time, from primordial landscape to settlements yet unbuilt. More disturbing still, he wrote in a letter to the Cincinnati Philosophical Society, each image contained 7 robed figures arranged in identical positions despite the changing backdrop. Their faces obscured, yet maintaining a terrible familiarity that caused me to abandon my equipment and flee Tennessee entirely. The figures moved between exposures, not as actors changing position for subsequent photographs, but rather as entities existing simultaneously across multiple temporal planes. I can describe the sensation only as watching a single gesture performed across millennia, with each movement leaving echoes backward and forward through time. The winter deepened with meteorological contradiction. Within the 7-mile radius, impossible weather patterns emerged, snowfall that ascended rather than descended, ice formations that grew in perfect heptagonal crystals, and fog that divided itself into 7 distinct layers of varying density. Most peculiar were reports that these weather phenomena aged those they touched according to their nature, snowflakes imparting youth with each melting contact, while the strange ascending mist leached vitality from anything passing through its vaporous embrace. January brought with it a pilgrimage of scholars drawn to the temporal enigma despite increasingly strident government warnings to avoid the region. Mathematician Theodore Willington established a research camp at the perimeter where he documented what he termed the arithmetic anomalies in the behavior of physical objects. When 7 identical pendulums are suspended within the influence of the lake, he recorded in journals later acquired by Princeton University, they quickly establish an impossible synchronicity wherein each operates at a different frequency yet returns to perfect alignment every 7th oscillation. More telling is the effect when observing cellular degradation. Organic matter that should decay uniformly instead breaks down in perfectly timed stages with 7 distinct phases occurring simultaneously across the sample. By February's waning days, the nocturnal illumination above the lake had intensified to such brilliance that it rivaled daylight within the 7-mile boundary. Witnesses described seeing human silhouettes moving within these auroral displays, 7 distinct figures performing elaborate circular movements that appeared both choreographed and desperately unwilling, their elongated shadows falling across the frozen landscape like the hands of some cosmic timepiece, marking hours unknown to mortal reckoning. March brought no reprieve to the altered land surrounding what had once been Holloway property. The air itself seemed to thicken with unnatural purpose, carrying scents that belonged to no season, the cloying sweetness of summer blossoms mingling with autumn's decay, the metallic clarity of winter frost overlaid with spring soil's fecund promise. Those who ventured near the boundary reported experiencing all 4 seasons simultaneously, their skin prickling with both sweat and goose flesh as internal temperatures fluctuated wildly within their bewildered bodies. The most disturbing phenomenon manifested in the behavior of timepieces brought within the 7-mile influence. Astronomical surveyor Phineas Thorne documented how his precision chronometers, when arranged in a perfect circle, began to register different hours despite their synchronized initiation. Most unsettling was his observation that these temporal discrepancies corresponded precisely to human developmental stages, the leftmost clock advancing at the accelerated pace of infant growth, the rightmost slowing to the glacial progression of senescence. "I have observed my own fingernails," Thorne wrote in his leather-bound journal, its pages now preserved beneath glass at Miskatonic University, "grow and recede 7 times between heartbeats when I stand at the lake's edge. My beard bristles forth and withdraws like tide upon sand, while the very cells of my exposed skin visibly migrate and regenerate in rolling waves of mortality." Yet more terrible is the awareness that accompanies these fluctuations, moments of infant incomprehension giving way to youthful clarity, then mature understanding, senescent wisdom, and finally, most disturbing of all, glimpses of consciousness from beyond death's threshold. The local flora responded with evolutionary acceleration that defied natural law. Saplings planted equidistant from the lake grew according to impossible patterns, those to the east maturing into ancient trees within weeks, their western counterparts remaining suspended in perpetual germination, while specimens to the north and south cycled between growth and recession in 7-day intervals. Botanist Eleanor Winthrop collected leaf samples that, when placed under microscope slides, continued to develop vascular structures of increasing complexity until the glass itself cracked along 7 perfect radial lines. Birds ceased their migrations over the affected territory entirely, creating a perfect circular void in the sky that local observers described as a hole torn in heaven's canvas. Those avian creatures that did remain within the boundary developed strange behavioral modifications, nesting in perfect heptagonal formations, laying clutches of precisely 7 eggs regardless of species, and most unnervingly, singing songs that incorporated 7 distinct time signatures simultaneously. The resulting harmony, wrote composer Frederick Homewood after visiting the region, creates a discordant resonance that somehow suggests melodies from civilizations yet unborn, alongside chants not heard since primitive man first shaped sound into meaning. When transcribed to paper, the notation forms patterns identical to the ripples observed on the lake's surface during moments of temporal disturbance. As equinox approached, those living within sight of the property reported dreams of increasing specificity, visions of 7 figures seated upon thrones arranged in circular formation, their features indistinct yet somehow familiar, their voices speaking in unison. The 7th cycle nears completion. What was borrowed must be returned. The hollow equilibrium shall be maintained. The vernal equinox of 1849 dawned with uncanny stillness across the Tennessee highlands. For 7 consecutive mornings, residents awoke to find dew crystallized in perfect heptagonal patterns upon their window panes, each droplet containing infinitesimal reflections of the circular lake that had once been Holloway land. Those who dared examine these miniature scenes through magnifying glasses reported seeing not the present state of the property, but rather 7 simultaneous versions overlaid like translucent theatrical scenery, the original homestead, the transformation, and 5 other iterations stretching impossibly backward and forward through time. The Millers View Parish records note a curious incident during Sunday services when the church bell, upon striking 7 times for morning call, continued to resonate long after the sexton had ceased pulling its rope. The tone shifted through 7 distinct harmonics before settling into a humming vibration that caused several congregants to fall into trance-like states, their lips moving in perfect synchronicity as they recited what witnesses described as genealogies of families not yet born, intertwined with bloodlines long extinct. Most troubling was the unanimous testimony that these involuntary utterances culminated with repeated references to the Holloway pattern and to the 7th vessel's imminent renewal. Physician Jonathan Hargrove documented unprecedented medical anomalies among patients residing within the 7-mile boundary. Wounds healed according to inexplicable timetables, deep lacerations mending in hours while minor scratches lingered for weeks. More alarming were his observations of childbirth within the affected region, where infants emerged bearing physical characteristics of advanced age, translucent skin, clouded eyes, articulated speech, only to transition rapidly through developmental stages before stabilizing at normal neonatal appearance after precisely 7 hours. I have measured the heartbeats of 7 patients of varying ages, Hargrove recorded in his medical journal, its margins filled with increasingly erratic calculations, and discovered a mathematical progression that defies physiological understanding. Their pulses, when graphed, form perfect mirrors of one another, suggesting a communal circulation, as though their life forces flow not independently, but as connected vessels within some greater circulatory system centered upon the Holloway property. By mid-April, the forest surrounding the circular lake had developed bizarre architectural properties. Trees no longer grew vertically, but instead bent toward common convergence points, their branches weaving together to form 7 dome-like structures equidistant around the water's circumference. Beneath these living cathedrals, the underbrush arranged itself in concentric rings of 7 distinct botanical families, each flowering in sequential waves that completed full cycles between sunrise and sunset, regardless of natural blooming seasons. Most significant was the discovery made by geologist Emmett Blackthorne upon analyzing soil cores extracted at measured intervals from the property's boundary. The stratification revealed perfect cylindrical columns of earth extending downward through known geological layers until reaching bedrock, where 7 circular impressions had been worn into the stone as though by centuries of ceremonial rotation. Within these impressions, Blackthorne recovered fragments of what appeared to be human remains, not buried in conventional fashion, but rather incorporated into the mineral structure of the stone itself, creating a biological-geological hybrid that his colleagues at Harvard refused to officially acknowledge upon examining his specimens. The implications are inescapable, Blackthorne wrote in correspondence later seized by federal authorities. The Holloway phenomenon predates not merely the family's occupation of this land, but perhaps civilization itself. They did not create this temporal anomaly, they merely activated what had waited here since time immemorial, a mechanism of cosmic recalibration that requires 7 human vessels to maintain its equilibrium. As May advanced with relentless purpose toward the 7th anniversary of the Holloway family's unholy transformation, the boundaries between worlds grew precariously thin. Shadows cast upon the circular lake no longer corresponded to the objects creating them, a single observer producing 7 distinct silhouettes upon the water's surface, each depicting a different stage of physical development. More unsettling still was the discovery that these shadow selves moved independently of their creators, performing intricate rotational patterns that local mathematician Harrison Thornfield identified as equations of temporal transference expressed through physical choreography. The most fearsome harbinger arrived with the first thunderstorm of summer. Lightning, when it struck within the 7-mile boundary, branched not downward, but spiraled inward from the circumference toward the lake in perfectly calculated arcs. Those who witnessed this spectacle from neighboring highlands reported that each thunderbolt briefly illuminated translucent figures standing upon the water's surface, 7 souls arranged in circular formation, their features indistinct, yet their postures suggesting both ritual purpose and terrible unwillingness. The storm spoke with human voices, wrote schoolmistress Catherine Winfield in her private journal, its pages now warped by proximity to the temporal disturbance, not in mundane language, but in emotional impressions that bypass the ear entirely. I perceived overwhelming longing from the smallest figure, ancient weariness from the largest, and most distinctly, grim determination from the central presence, whose outline precisely matched descriptions of the Holloway's seventh child. Livestock throughout the county began delivering monstrous offspring, calves with 7 eyes arranged in perfect circular formation, lambs whose wool grew in spiral patterns containing microscopic renderings of human faces. Most alarming were the reports from Miller's View midwife Hannah Stillwater, who documented 7 simultaneous births occurring during the midnight hour of the summer solstice, each infant emerging with identical birthmarks across their left shoulders, interlocking rings representing stages of the moon from new to full and back again. Naturalist Theodore Blackburn, camping at the 7-mile perimeter, reported observing migration patterns among nocturnal creatures that defied biological explanation. Moths, bats, and nightjars arrange themselves in concentric formations after sunset, he wrote in trembling script. Each species occupying its appointed ring as they spiral inward toward the lake with mathematical precision. Most disturbing is their synchronized movement, thousands of individual creatures moving as a single entity to create living representations of clockwork mechanisms turning ever inward. The circular lake itself had begun to rotate, not its waters flowing in conventional current, but rather the entire body revolving slowly clockwise while its surface remained mirror-smooth. Objects placed upon this impossible carousel neither sank nor drifted, but maintained their positions as though affixed to invisible spokes extending from an unseen central axis. Most chilling was the observation that this rotation had established perfect synchronicity with the movement of shadows around the sundial at Miller's View Courthouse, suggesting that the Holloway anomaly had somehow yoked itself to terrestrial timekeeping mechanisms, binding cosmic forces to human constructs of temporal measurement. By June's waning days, the air above the former Holloway property had acquired visible stratification, 7 distinct layers of atmosphere visible to the naked eye, each refracting light at different wavelengths to create a shimmering prismatic dome over the site. Those who gazed too long reported seeing human figures moving within these atmospheric bands, conducting elaborate ceremonies with movements that seemed both ancient and prophetic, as though performing rituals simultaneously remembered and foreseen. The night of June 21, 1852, 7 years to the day since the 7th Holloway child drew first breath, descended upon Tennessee with unnatural precision. Darkness fell not gradually, but as though a celestial hand had extinguished the sun, plunging the highlands into immediate night. The air grew dense with anticipation, carrying scents of ozone and freshly turned soil intermingled with the cloying sweetness of tobacco flowers blooming out of season. At precisely 7 minutes before midnight, the circular lake began to pulse with bioluminescent radiance, each rhythmic wave perfectly synchronized with the collective heartbeats of every living creature within the 7-mile boundary. Witnesses perched upon distant ridgelines observed how the illumination revealed 7 distinct figures emerging from the surrounding forest, their gaits mechanical yet fluid as they approached the shore with inevitable purpose. Professor Warrington's long-abandoned astronomical equipment, still positioned on the Highland Observatory, activated spontaneously, telescope lenses adjusting of their own accord, mechanical gears turning without human intervention as they trained themselves upon the lake. Those scholars brave enough to peer through the eyepiece in subsequent days would discover perfectly preserved images scored into the glass itself, 7 figures arranged in circular formation, their faces simultaneously those of children and ancients, their postures suggesting supplication beneath a sky crowded with constellations that would not exist for centuries yet to come. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, who had maintained vigilant observation of the property since inheriting his position from the long-vanished Sheriff Whitley, documented the climactic manifestation from the boundary stone marking the precise 7-mile perimeter. The figures converged at shore's edge, arranging themselves by height, from a stooped ancient no taller than a child to a towering youth with eyes of unfathomable antiquity. As midnight approached, they moved in perfect synchronicity onto the water's surface, their feet creating no ripples as though reality itself accommodated their passage. At the lake center, they formed their circle, hands extending to grasp one another across the void between them. The moment their circuit completed, the very air seemed to tear asunder. I perceived 7 distinct planes of existence overlaid upon our own, each containing the same circular lake, yet surrounded by different landscapes, primordial wilderness, ancient settlements, future architectures beyond comprehension. Most terrible was the realization that identical circles of 7 figures stood upon each of these intersecting realities, their movements mirroring those before me with microscopic precision. As the courthouse bell tolled midnight, I witnessed what can only be described as the completion of their terrible exchange. Vitality flowed visibly between them like liquid light, youth draining from some while infusing others, creating a perfect equilibrium of temporal energy. The 7th child, now a man in his prime, appeared momentarily as all 7 ages simultaneously before settling into the form of a patriarch, while the ancient figure at his right hand transformed into an infant with eyes of profound comprehension. The transference complete, reality snapped back into singular focus with such violence that pine trees at the property's edge shattered into precise 7-fold fragments. The figures remained briefly visible upon the lake's now placid surface before dissolving into the water itself, leaving behind perfect circular ripples that expanded outward with mathematical precision until reaching shore exactly 7 minutes after midnight. The hollow cycle had reset itself for another 7 years. The vessels rearranged, but the terrible balance maintained. Time would continue its fractured flow around the circular lake where natural law surrendered to older, stranger geometries of existence. The Tennessee State Archives still hold Thomas Blackwood's weathered sketchbook, its leather binding cracked with age, pages filled with meticulous drawings of the 7 thrones that periodically materialized around the lake. His illustrations reveal an unsettling evolution, each cycle rendering the stone seats increasingly anatomical in appearance, developing veins of quartz that pulsed with faint luminescence during certain astronomical alignments, while the smallest throne gradually assumed proportions that no human infant could possibly occupy. Following the completion of the 7-year cycle, a peculiar amnesia descended upon Miller's view. Residents who had documented the Holloway phenomenon with religious fervor suddenly found their memories clouded by mundane recollections that obscured the terrible truth. Town council minutes from July of 1852 revealed discussions about road maintenance and property boundaries where once had been impassioned debates about temporal anomalies and cosmic intervention. Only in dreams did the unvarnished reality persist. Regional physicians documented an epidemic of somnambulism throughout the highlands that summer, with dozens of sleepwalkers found each dawn arranged in perfect heptagonal formations across fields and town squares, their unconscious bodies oriented toward the circular lake with mathematical precision. The land itself retained physical evidence that resisted the collective forgetting. Surveyors dispatched by the Tennessee Land Authority discovered that compasses failed within the 7-mile boundary, their needles spinning through 7 distinct orientations before settling on directions that corresponded to no conventional understanding of magnetism. More telling were growth patterns in ancient oaks beyond the perimeter, their rings forming not concentric circles but perfect heptagons, with 7 years of abnormal lignification followed by 7 of standard development, a pattern repeating back through centuries of arboreal history. Tobacco harvested within sight of the lake developed unprecedented properties. When dried and burned, the smoke formed shapes of unsettling specificity, miniature human silhouettes arranged in circular formations that performed microscopic rituals before dissolving. Those who inhaled this smoke reported dreams of impossible clarity in which they observed the Holloway family in their original configuration, seated around their dining table as though frozen between moments, neither aging nor speaking, simply waiting for some unspecified completion. Most significant was the discovery made by ethnologist Rebecca Thornfield when interviewing elderly Cherokee displaced decades earlier from these same highlands. Their oral tradition spoke of the 7 who walk between, describing a circular clearing where time flowed according to different laws. Their ancestors had established sacred boundaries around this place, appointing 7 guardians who would never approach the center but maintain vigilant observation from the periphery. According to their eldest storyteller, the white family broke the circle, stepping where they should not walk, taking seats that were not meant for them. The federal government eventually established the Tennessee Quarantine Authority in 1859, purchasing all lands within the 7-mile boundary and erecting a perimeter of watchtowers disguised as fire observation posts. Agents maintained continuous surveillance, their reports sealed in archives that remain classified to this day. Local legends persist of 7-year cycles when unusual visitors arrive, academics with strange credentials, religious scholars from obscure orders, astronomers without university affiliations, all granted temporary access to observe what official records describe merely as the recurring phenomenon. The circular lake now stands in silent testament to cosmic truths our limited sciences barely begin to comprehend. This has been Roots of Fear. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.